It up, go along. Anyway, we're getting towards the end of Nehemiah, and for those of you who have been journeying with us, Nehemiah is the story of the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. Nehemiah is called by God for the mission of rebuilding the walls. But what we've seen through the book is that the first half of Nehemiah is about the physical rebuilding of the walls, the logistics of how do you build walls around a city. It's not just a fence, it's a pretty significant task. And then the second half of Nehemiah is the story of the restoration of the people of God, that God was actually drawing his people back to himself. And so there's the physical side of Jerusalem being restored, but also after the exile, which is about 70 years of exile, the people are then being restored back to being the people of God that they are meant to be salt and light to the nations around them, to shine the light of God to the nations around them. And then we've been sort of journeying through that. And last week we were kind of exploring the stuff around the people basically rededicated themselves back to God. They recognized that they had lost their way, that they had not been the people that God had called them to be. And they made this rededication of going, we again will be the people of God. And they committed to honour all the commands that God had given them as their people, and some very specific ones along the way. And last week we had a conversation around, we broke the room up in two halves. This half was about, what does it look like to love God with all that we are? And this one was, what does it look like to love our neighbour as ourselves? And we got some feedback from that. And then now we're up to chapters 11 and 12. And God kind of puts a bit of an ask on the people of Israel who have been exiled. They've been scattered all over Judea. And the city of Jerusalem has been rebuilt. The temple took 20 years to rebuild. The walls took 52 days. So about 20 years and 52 days later, there is then the call for the people of Israel, where God says to the people, I want you to put me first. You've already made these commitments, but I'm going to ask something of you. And through chapters 11 and 12, there's a list of names in there, which is why we're not reading it, because there's just a whole lot of names in there. But these are the people who chose, when God asked them, they said, we will go back to Jerusalem. We will go back to the city that has been destroyed, that has been in ruins, which has been slowly reestablished. We will go back to Jerusalem and we will resettle that place as your people. And so what God asked was 1 in 10. 10% of the population of the people of Israel, he said, I want 10% of you to go back and resettle Jerusalem, to make it the city of God that it should be. And what he was saying to the people essentially was, I want you to put my agenda of resettling this city, because this is how people understood where God lived, was in the temple in Jerusalem. He said, I want you to put my agenda first. Now, I'm going to ask this question. I was just thinking about how to ask it. How many of you are under 70? All right, cool. All right. So the exile has been happening for 70 years. So all of you under 70, if you've been exiled in this time, you would have only known the place where you were currently living. You wouldn't have known anything else. And for some of you, your parents, they would have gone and they would have taken up residence somewhere. They would have started farming. They would have started their families. They would have started all the things that families do. Even though they were exiled, they weren't imprisoned. So they were free to build their lives again. Because the goal of the exile was to actually break down culture, not to imprison people. Often when we think that people get punished, they get locked up. But they weren't locked up. They were just told to live in different places around Judea. So imagine God going to the families who have only ever known the exile, essentially, and saying, I want you to leave what you have built. I want you to leave the land that you're on. I want you to leave your lifestyle that you have, and I want you to go back to a city that is in ruins. I want you to go back to a city that will be under threat because people don't like the city of God. I want you to go back to a place where it's going to be hard, where you won't always have all your friends, where you're going to have to start again. And he asked the people, he said, will you do that? Will 10% of the people do that? And there were some who were volunteers, said, yep, I'm in. The pioneering spirit shone through. But there were others where they kind of drew lots and they went and they were tasked to go back. The leaders were already living in the city. They'd already set the example. They'd gone back and said, yep, they'd gone back to establish the walls and do the building there. But then there was the ask of the people. Would you go? Would you put the agenda of God above your own comfort? That's a big question, isn't it? Because how do we put God's agenda first? What does that look like in our lives? Because we all have our lives, right? We have jobs, we have activities, we have families, we have tasks, the things that we do. Some of that is around the church that we're involved with. Some of it's around our hobbies and our activities. So what does it look like when we kind of say, how do we keep God's agenda first? So if we want to pop up the next slide, thanks, Shona. Hopefully we've got the right slide coming up. Putting God's agenda first. Sometimes it's simply in the small and everyday things. You know, it's about, I guess, having that mindset and that focus that when you enter every day, that you would be open to the fact that God will want to speak to you and God will lead you in particular times and moments throughout your day. Last week when we were talking about, how do we love our neighbour, I think it was Paul from the sound desk who sort of said, sometimes it's just, those little acts of kindness to the people around us. So it could be like, remember a few months ago, Nate and I had gone down to Parklands for a coffee and we discovered someone had a flat tyre and we offered to help someone. Sometimes that's God's agenda, right? To be a blessing to someone else in a very small, practical, tangible way. Maybe it's a word of encouragement. Maybe it's simply listening to someone who is having a hard time. So putting God's agenda first is sometimes in the small things of every day. The next one, thanks, Shona. So the next one is in our own personal spiritual life. Now this is a bit of a paradox statement, right? Because we talk about our own personal spiritual life, but the reality is that we don't have a personal spiritual life because we are called into a community of faith, not to an individual's faith. And that's really hard because we often talk about a personal relationship with God and we talk about our quiet times and things like that, but this is actually the community of faith of coming together. But it's having those spiritual practices in our lives that help us connect with God so that we might know the voice of God, so that we might know when God is speaking to us and that we might be able to respond. And that will look different depending on your season of life. For some people, when they're in their young adult years and are studying and things like that, they have a lot of time. Now, for those students amongst us, you don't believe that you have a lot of time, but trust me, you have a lot of time. And you can immerse yourself in studying the scriptures and learning and doing all sorts of things. Sometimes when I meet with young families, they kind of go, we don't have the same time to sit and read the Bible as we did because there's always a small person wanting something. They're called children. And that's the reality of life. But we need to learn that, that the spiritual disciplines, the routines that we have will change as our families change. But it's still about making them a priority. It's about incorporating our tamariki into what we do in our spiritual practices. It's about being present to God. It's about learning to pray perhaps differently or learning to pray with others and turning up and being present. So putting God's agenda first is also acknowledging how do we walk with Jesus on a daily basis? And what does that look like for our stage of life? How do we make the time? When we're younger, we have time. When we're young families and working, it can be busy. And some of you, when you're older, you've got more time again to sit down with those practices and go, how do we sit and listen to what God is asking? How do we have the practices that help us engage in the things of God? Next one, thanks, Shona. And serving. Finding a way to use your gifts and talents where you kind of go, I offer this to be a blessing to God and a blessing to others. Now, the question that Steve asked earlier when I asked the question about serving in local church, we do a lot of stuff on Sunday, but that's not all that we do. And there are plenty of places to serve. Some is here on Sunday, others in other places. People were at our op shop yesterday, people who turned up on Friday to help set up. Some of you are involved in different ministries through the week, like Recharge and other things that happen, Evergreens, all sorts of things, small groups, all sorts of things that happen in serving. And so that's one way that we engage. And I find that when we serve together, we deepen our faith together. How many of you enjoy doing a project with others? I should have made this would you rather. Would you rather do a project on your own, put your hand up, or a project with others? On your own? These are the perfectionists in the room, just quietly. With others? I'd much rather do something with others. It's far more fun, right? Way more enjoyable. You get the job done quicker, you learn things about one another. And this is what serving's about. It's not always on your own. It's partnering with others in the things of the kingdom, noticing where God calls us to and what that might look like. Next one, thanks, Shona. Sometimes it's a big ask. Sometimes God gives us a big ask. When we were living in Canberra, when I first went to Canberra, I went as probably one of the older youth and young adults pastors. I was almost 40 at the time. And so I was a youth and young adults pastor and responsible for our Sunday PM congregation. So as a church, we had 3 congregations on a Sunday, 2 in the morning and 1 in the evening. A building that seats a similar size to this. And when I got there, the youth ministry had about 15 kids in it, and we had half a dozen leaders. There was about 60 people in the Sunday evening congregation. And over the next 3 years, I basically did what I've always done in ministry, but God seemed to bless it differently this time. And we just saw amazing growth. And I think within about 3 years, I went from having 6 youth leaders. We had a team of 35 youth leaders. It was amazing. There were people we just spent a lot of time hanging out and serving God together, and the youth ministry grew. Our Sunday evening congregation became the biggest congregation of the 3, and it was just a really vibrant energy in the ministry. One of the highlights of our PM congregation is that one Sunday evening we had 10 baptisms. It was just fun. We regularly had baptism, but we had 10 baptisms one night. There was no sermon because every testimony was a sermon about the goodness of God. And so there was just this really rich, it was one of those moments where you kind of look around and go, I love what I do. This is going so well. I really enjoyed the people I worked with and served with. And it was a lot of hard work, but it was a lot of fun at the same time. And when you see God at work, it's just like, this is really rich stuff going on. And then I have a conversation with my senior pastor because one of the things that we'd noticed was that, because we had 6 pastors on team, and we were a regional church in Canberra, so we kind of drew people from all over sort of the Canberra region. We were on the north side of Canberra. And we had started to get a number of families coming from a new suburb, a growth corridor, a place called Gungahlin. I was going to put it up on the screen and go, have a crack at saying that, because that's not your everyday Kiwi word, Gungahlin. But then we realised we had about 50 families from the suburb coming over. And so my senior pastor called me in and said, we've been thinking that we need to do something in Gungahlin. And we want you to lead that. I'm like, okay. I'm kind of loving what I'm doing at the moment, and you want me to lay that down? And he's like, yeah. Okay. So Ros and I had been involved in a church plant in Brisbane, and we kind of knew that it was a lot of work. Church planting is not for the faint-hearted. In fact, only about 50% of church plants that ever get started ever go on. So there's a high failure rate. That's not always good for your self-esteem when you pour yourself into something and then after a while it doesn't exist anymore. And I had to pick my timing with Ros, and I said, guess what? We've been asked to plant a congregation because we're doing a multi-site thing in Gungahlin. And so we prayed about it. We had a few conversations about that over a couple of weeks, and eventually we agreed that we would say yes. And which meant for us as a family that we would leave the community that we were connected into, and we would go and plant a new community. And so I spent about 4 months visiting the families there, and sort of said, look, we're thinking about doing something new out here. Would you be interested? We had about 50% of the people say yes. And so we had about 25 families who kind of committed to go and be part of this. And so then we started the journey of going, well, what's the vision for it? How do we get people invested? So every fortnight we would do a lunch. And you would think that people who are committed to something new would turn up. Every fortnight it was 12 different people. That's really hard to try and sow vision into something. Go, let's start again. Anyway, we persevered. So we've been doing this for the year. We got to September. And then my senior pastor announces that he's leaving. Thanks. So his vision, planting this, he's leaving. It's like, okay, do we lay this down? What do we do? Anyway, we sensed that God was still calling us to it. So we committed to it. And we continued on. And then March the following year, we launched. We finally found a venue. One of the things that they tell you about church planting is that every school hall already has a church in it. So when you want to start, it's really hard to find a venue. We just happened to come across a new school that didn't have anyone in there. And so we got to March, and I remember very clearly that at each congregation that we had, the 3 congregations, they got us up and we said, we want to pray for the people who are going to go. And they invited people from the congregation who wanted to be part of this plant to come up on front, and the church will pray for them. And so people who had been part of the visioning came and stood with me. To my amazement, people I'd never spoken to also decided they wanted to be part of it. So they came and stood up the front and like, okay. We launched, and we were in a school hall. It had bright green flooring, like really bright green flooring. And we started with a trailer, and you'd turn up, and you'd set up, and you'd run church, and you'd pack up. And I've got to tell you that for the first 2 months, every Sunday I had a knot in my stomach as I drove to church. And the knot in my stomach was, I wonder if they've all gone back, because it's way easier to go back. There's a kids ministry with a kids pastor. There's a full music team. You don't have to set up chairs. You don't have to lug tables. You don't have to set up your coffee. You don't have to do all that stuff. So it took me 2 months to kind of get over that, when finally it kind of sank in that these people are committed. We're here. And it was hard work. I don't know if you know or not, but in Canberra, actually someone put a post yesterday. It was like, temperature is 2.1 degrees, feels like -9. Happy days. So in winter in Canberra, it normally got to between -3 and -6. So on a Sunday morning, when you go to pick up the trailer, it was more, in winter, it was normally -degrees, and you're trying to hook the trailer up and take it out and unload it and so forth. But it was a big ask. It cost us as a family. My kids got pulled out of the kids ministry to a little group there. The upside was there were real blessings. Our kids got involved in ministry like they never could before. Lauren got involved in doing the data for the screen. Ethan, he must have been about 7 or 8. He was part of the hospitality team. He was making coffees. Ros headed up our hospitality team, and she just had this vision of going, we're not doing packets of biscuits. We're doing homemade baking every Sunday. And that was one of our goals. And there was a team who committed to that. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of hard work. But it cost us as well. After 2 years, we managed to buy a property off the Salvation Army, and we finally had our own space. And we could, because we had this really hard little space for our kids ministry, which was great in summer, horrible in winter. Outside wasn't fun in winter. But sometimes God gives us a big ask, and He challenges us. Go, will you lay down what is comfortable in pursuit of something more? Not easier, not more comfortable, but something more. And we had some amazing experiences as part of that plant. Like I said, seeing our kids involved in ministry was one of the real blessings. They just sort of thrived in that and loved it. Ros really enjoyed that aspect of ministry, of serving in that way. We had a family contact us. And they'd been part of the church a number of years beforehand. Anyway, they contacted us, and this woman, she said, I need some prayer support. I'm pregnant. I've been to the doctor. They've told me that I should terminate the pregnancy because the baby isn't viable. And I don't know what to do. And I'd really like prayer. So we pulled together a little prayer team, and we went and visited her and one evening, and we spent a couple of hours hearing her story, seeing her pain, and we just prayed over that baby and over her. And one of the greatest joys that I experienced as part of that church plant was when we dedicated that child as part of our service, where we could see that God had done a healing in that baby and in that family. And it was a real joy to be part of that. I don't know if that would have happened if we weren't there in that suburb. I don't know. Probably because God's bigger than our plans, right? But it was just such a rich privilege to be part of that. And so the idea that sometimes there's a big ask, we don't always know the cost. We don't always know the journey. We don't always know all that God is asking of us. But if we're going to be the kind of people, if we're going to be the kind of church that says we want to put God's agenda first, we need to recognise that sometimes it'll be in the small things, the everyday things, sometimes it's in our own life, other times it's as we serve, and sometimes it's the big ask. It's laying down what's comfortable to take up what we believe God is asking of us. And it's being willing to trust God, even though we don't always understand what the next step looks like, right? Because that's how we define faith, right? A hope in something that we don't always see, isn't always realised. And so for us as a church, and as we think about the story of Nehemiah, God put a big ask on these families and said, uproot your family, go back to Jerusalem. It's not comfortable, but that's my city. That's my place. And I want my people there. And he invited them into it. And many volunteered. There's a passage in Zechariah. You want to pop that up? Thanks, Shona. Passage in Zechariah. And this is actually about these people going back to Jerusalem. Zechariah is speaking to them. He says, don't despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. As the people were called to go back to Jerusalem, the prophet Zechariah says to them, don't despise the day of small beginnings, the small things that you do now. It may not seem significant to go, I'm moving from here back to Jerusalem to the ruins. But one day, because of your faithfulness now, one day there will be something that will bear fruit for the kingdom that we will not realise or see. And so for some of you, you've been serving, you've been giving, you've been doing the little things behind the scenes. Don't despise those small beginnings. The times that you serve, when you're the last one here turning out the lights, when you turn up to music practice and there's only you and a small team, when there's only a few of us at the prayer meeting, don't despise those times of small beginnings, because it's as we commit to doing what we believe God is calling us to do, to put him first, that we will then see the fruit of the kingdom around us. We've had a dream for this op shop, and we had this wonderful vision, like, we'll get a manager, we'll start, it'll be great, with a big bang. That's not how it's beginning. But we're not going to despise the fact that it's only 3 hours on a Saturday morning as a beginning. Because God will build something in that if we're faithful and continue to put him first. So as we've journeyed through Nehemiah, God wants to rebuild his people, as we see in Nehemiah. God continues to want to build his church, and God will build his church, but he calls us to participate and put the things of the kingdom first. Put God first. And I look around this room and I can see that many of you do. So please don't think this is a telling off. That's not what this is about. But I want to encourage you to continue to put the things of God first. Because sometimes it's easy to get distracted. I get distracted. Sometimes it's easy to think, I'll do something else today. Sometimes we wish we could do something else today. But as we turn up, as we continue to want to honour Jesus, to love God with all that we are, heart, mind and soul, and love our neighbour as ourselves, that's how we prioritise God and put him first. I'm going to go back one slide. Thanks, Shona. So think about these things this week. Well, the small everyday things you can do to put God first. In your own spiritual life, maybe you've dropped off in some areas and it's like, I just need to get back to that. And serving. Or maybe God has been nudging you about a big ask. To step into something that it seems bigger than you. and you've been a bit nervous about that, I'd encourage you to start the conversation. Because if that's what God's asking you to do, don't put it off. Be faithful to the things that God calls you to. Check in with people. Get people around you. I've spoken way too long. So I'm going to pray and I'm going to invite the team up. Jesus, we just want to thank you for the encouragement in the book of Nehemiah. We thank you for people who have been faithful here at North Point in years gone by, faithfully putting you first, giving sacrificially financially, giving sacrificially of their time, wanting to honour you. We thank you that this exists because of other people's sacrifice, because of your sacrifice for your church. And God, as we're here today, we ask, God, that you would continue to encourage us towards that, being open to the things of your kingdom, placing you first. Forgive us for the times when we don't, when we get distracted, when we look for other things instead of looking towards you. And Lord, we thank you for the joy that comes as we spend time in your presence, serving alongside, wanting to honour you above all else. And we thank you, Jesus. Amen.